And we're live. This is
Hey,
Literary
everybody.
Road. Oh, yeah, I was going to go right into it. People still watch. I think we get like 4 people every week to watch this for.
Come on.
That's why we have live and all nicely edited and pretty. Hit it, girl.
All right. This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story, once a week. I'm Anais.
I'm Gerald.
And I'm Maya. And while I don't foresee this particular story getting too rambunctious, occasionally we do slip into potty language. And so this is our warning. If we do slip into potty language, we will have a language warning on both the website and on iTunes.
And if you haven't read The Nose by Nikolai Gogol and don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, and then come back. So the story takes place in late March, early April in St. Petersburg, Russia, some year in the 1830s. A former major, now a member of the municipal committee named Kovalev, wakes up one morning to find that his nose is missing from his face. He's disturbed by how this will affect his ambitions to climb the class ranks and his ability to woo fair ladies and eventually marry a rich one. He goes out with a handkerchief around his face and finds his nose in the uniform of a state councilor, visiting mansions and being chauffeured in a private carriage with servants attending to him. He tries to talk to the nose, but now that he's a lower rank than the nose, finds it difficult to approach it. The nose leaves, and Major Kovalev decides to put an ad in the paper to offer a reward for the return of his nose. The paper rejects him. There's a funny scene. Read the story. And then he goes to the police commissioner and is insulted when the commissioner says that things like this don't happen to respectable people. So he goes home, there's a knock at the door, and it's another police officer who's come to return his nose. He tries to fix it on his face, but it won't stick. He calls for a doctor. The doctor insists that Kovalev is better off not trying to reattach it because the consequences of reattaching it could be worse than his current condition. The doctor leaves, and there's this one vague line that I think suggests that the doctor is the nose in disguise. We can debate that. But the nose runs around St. Petersburg for a couple of weeks, attracting crowds wherever it goes, until one day Major Kovalev wakes up with his nose back on his face. Feeling better about himself, he goes out, compares his nose to the size of other men's nose, resumes flirting, and falls back in step with his high-class life. And that's my
Okay, this story was written in what, 18 or 1830s? I have to know. I just want to know. Did people used to play the game, I've got your nose with little children before or after this story?
Very good.
He actually thought I had his nose, and he ran around screaming and had like a complete meltdown because he thought I had honestly stolen his nose. And I just want to know, is that where that game comes from? And like the expression, your nose despite your face. Like I'm just, this whole story was just hysterical. So what did everybody think of it, just top level?
I think I'm just going to sit in the corner and say nothing.
What, you didn't like it?
I hated it with a vengeance.
Old satire can be difficult to translate into modern day. How about you, Anais? How did you like it up front?
So, I was struggling with the translation, which I think must have been really poor. Maybe Russian is just very particular. So because the writing was kind of like hard to flow through, or at least the translation, that kind of got me caught up in it, as well as those weird sort of like fade outs after every section. But the more I thought about the story, the more I liked it. It's one of those that as I'm reading it, I'm like, okay. And then at the end of it, I'm like, that was actually really funny. So I'm kind of in the middle.
You know, it is interesting because satire is a very specific type of writing. I could never write satire, I don't think. And this is probably the second piece of old satire I've read, and I liked it just as much as the first piece. I read Way of All Flesh ages ago, loved it. And I love this story. I found it really funny, and funny in like a really dry, just absurdist kind of way, and it gave me these awesome visuals. Like Did either of you, like, picture in your head what this nose running around town actually must look like? Like, I'm, like, picturing this giant white schnoz with, like, ruffled collar and tight pants and, you know, the sword. I'm just cracking up the whole time. It is difficult to read, though, because it's not modern, and so not only is the language just slightly different as far as like the way things are phrased, but also the names are hard to read. If you're not used to reading a lot of Russian literature, names can really trip you up. The second translation, the one that you updated, is good. I actually recommend people read both translations when you're talking about Russian literature, because you're right, Russian literature can be really funky depending on the translation. It's like Japanese. It's almost like a different book. And so since it's such a short story, you're not going to miss out by reading both, but I would read the translation that's currently on the website first because it is an easier read than the one, I think it was probably an earlier translation. But I love the story. I found it well written, super funny, very absurdist, very light. It got me enough in the moment that I was able to picture this stuff, which I appreciated.
Reading the story, I was just going to say, reading the story, I was also struck by a lot of things where I was like, a modern-day writer could not get away with this, including those like misty fade-outs between each section.
Oh, totally. Have you read War and Peace? Oh, that would get slaughtered. That would get slaughtered by an editor.
And as an editor, why do you need the barber? That whole scene with the barber and his wife in the beginning. The barber does nothing for the story. Nothing.
But he's the one that finds the nose, and he's the one that tugs on people's noses.
He doesn't have to. You can have the maid wake up, be like, I don't have my nose. Go out into the street. There's my nose. That's it.
That's one of the differences between modern and older writing. Like, seriously, I wasn't exaggerating. When I open up War and Peace, like, on every single page, show don't tell, weird tense shifts, just you name it, everything that you were told as a new writer not to do, Tolstoy does it. He breaks those rules, but he does it in a way that's really elegant, that's really well done. And I, a lot of times when I read old literature, I have to remember that the literary conventions were different in the 1800s than they are now, because it's a very different reading experience.
Yeah, I didn't have any trouble reading it. I think I appreciated that it was well written. It's accessible. The language is, especially in the second translation, is pretty straightforward. But there was a big disconnect for me, I'm afraid.
Was it one of those things like with the magical realism? Originally, when we started doing magical realism, you know, you liked some of it that had rules. You didn't like the magical realism that didn't have rules. Do you think that this story was falling into the not enough rules for you to wrap your head around?
Oh yeah, it's just okay. You know, the barber finds the nose in his role, okay, and the guy wakes up and he hasn't got a nose. That's okay. And then the nose is running around in a cape and with a sword, and no one seems to think it's something a bit strange about this. They're just accepting it's going in a carriage, and I just think, what? So I
but that's the definition of magical realism. You have all this crazy stuff going on, and everyone thinks it's normal.
Yeah.
It's that disconnect between what is real and what isn't real. Like, is his nose actually off his face, or is this like a metaphor for something? What do you think?
Well, for the story, it's off his face. Like if you were to stage this, I had read something somewhere when I was doing a little bit of research that
staged.
Yeah, like originally when Gogol wrote the first draft, it was all a dream. And he was like, actually, that's really lame. This actually happens.
I love it.
Commitment.
What a major trope. Even in 1500, having it all be a dream was just a step too far.
Yeah, I hate the sort of anything that goes anywhere near. You know, he woke up and it was all a dream. Thank God for that. And you know, it's appalling. It's terrible, that sort of thing. But in this story, I think I'd have liked that. I think I would have thought, yeah, that's a good ending for me.
Oh man, that's funny.
You knew I would feel like this about it.
You think she picked it just for you? Anais, was this a plot?
I didn't know what it was about.
Oh, really? You pulled a me then. You picked a story and just jumped. Like, I know nothing about the story that I've been submitting. I just pick one, random.
Well, see, this one I picked.
I find great stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this one I picked because it's like a literary classic. It'll like pop up on random must-read lists. I'm like, oh, it's a must-read. Let's read it then. But I hadn't read it before.
No.
You know what I find about Russian literature in particular is that it feels really modern a lot of times when I read it, but especially, you know, when you're talking about their comedy and their satire, it seems to translate better into modern day. Like, the humor actually translates well, which I really appreciate.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe it's because a lot of these jokes in this story are being told by a really sassy, sarcastic, and cynical narrator who like hates all the characters. Like, he has something bad to say about every single person in the story. And it's, you know, when Gerald said it's an accessible read, I wanted to add, yeah, because there's nothing subtle about it. Like, it's like, tell us how you really feel, Gogol, about, you know, the bougies. Like, how do you feel? It's going over my head.
Whereas when you read like a lot of Shakespeare's satire and comedy, a lot of the jokes, unless you really understand Shakespearean language, a lot of those jokes are puns and stuff, and they can go right over your head. They're not so blatant. And so it's harder to, I think it's sometimes when you're talking about that kind of comedy and satire, it's easier to watch it on stage than it is to read it. But I found this really easy to read it and still get the humor. I'm sad Gerald didn't like this story.
Don't be
sad.
Is there anything else? Is there anything
Was it mainly that, or was it mainly just the lack of rules, or was there other parts of the story that you didn't like?
No, it's just a lack of rules. I you know, the characters. At the point at where the nose was from, and I can't say it without laughing. So there is humour in it, obviously, but yeah, when I got to the point where the nose was running around in a cape and the sword and getting into a carriage, had I not been doing Literary Roadhouse, I would have stopped and I'd said, no, not for me. But I did carry on, and so in a way, I sort of enjoyed it, maybe a bit, but I just, you know. I disconnected from the story and then just sort of, I suppose, freewheeled through the reading from then on. But it was I loved his writing. You
did. That's good. What was it about his writing that you liked in particular? Like, could you pick out anything in particular that you liked?
No, I liked this because the nose thing, which is obviously the whole point of the story, the nose thing. If you took that out, then it was I know, just bear with me here. It's just stop cackling. That it's quite it's a good story. There's good characters, you know, funny situations, the humour. So that's you know, that I liked all that, but I didn't like the whole point of the story. So there you go.
Anais, if you took Star Wars and just got rid of all the spaceships and that stupid story, it's such a great movie.
Just guns and shit. Oh, sorry. Oops. Yeah, guns and stuff. And there goes our rating.
So, Anais, what was it outside of the comedy? Was there anything else in the story in particular that you enjoyed?
I like the way that it kind of played with like class tropes a little bit. Like, okay, so you have this nose that when it was just a nose on the Major's face, which is like as intimate as it could possibly be. Like, what's closer to you than a part of yourself? As soon as it, you know, like leaves his face and becomes a state councilor, doesn't even recognize him. Like, when the Major goes up to him and he's like, "You're my nose," he's like, "No, you must be mistaken." Like, making fun of people who suddenly, go up in the ranks and don't remember their friends. Like, oh, the nose is playing that now.
Totally.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I was gonna say, and if I am right, I'm pretty sure that the doctor who tells him you can't reattach your nose is the nose in disguise, which is then, if it is, which I prefer that reading of it, then there's this like sort of subtle difference between when the nose was dressed up as a higher ranking official, as a state counselor. Now the major paid attention and looked long enough to notice it's his nose. But when it's a lower ranking doctor, he doesn't even bother looking at him, doesn't know it's his nose. Because it has
I love that reading.
Yeah.
I love that reading of it. And that's like a really subtle, oh, I like that. Yeah, I did not read it that way, but I like that a lot.
That's very good, yeah.
I would say that I love the language, and there was this jaunty, like, rhythm through the story as I was reading it. Like, it was a rhythmic kind of musical reading as I was going that I really enjoyed. And I enjoyed the visuals. I felt like the visuals were really strong, really vivid. There were a couple points where that silly song from the 90s that I'm trying to keep our non-explicit rating, but it's detachable, in quote, male member, and it's a song about it going off on its own and all the things it would do if it didn't have like a guy that it was attached to. Like, that was running through my head, I'm like, as I was reading it. And I appreciate writing that is that musical, and I don't know if that was part of the original story or if that was the translation, because, again, we're running into that issue where the difference between what the writer writes and what the translator writes can be very different, and a translation is an art to itself, and sometimes a translation is better than the original. So, I don't know if that musical quality is in the original Russian, but I really enjoyed it in the translation we read.
And with a translator, I think it's very difficult for a translator to not impose some of their own reading of the story into their translation.
Well, that's part of the art of translation. Like, if you study translation, they teach you not to translate it word for word, because then you're going to not be able to get across the meaning of the author. And so a lot of it is interpretation and what is the themes and what is the feeling and the tone, and that all is coming through the translator's reading of the story. Anais looks like she wants to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I agree that the nose is, pretty phallic, because when he doesn't have the nose and he comes across like the pretty girl in the street, he's about to go like mac on her, and then he remembers, I don't have a nose, and he can't do it anymore. But then as soon as he gets his nose back, he goes out and he's like, oh, look at that guy's nose. That guy's nose is like a waistcoat button. It's so small. My nose is way bigger. And then he goes and he sits on with him again.
You're killing me, Anais, but it's totally true. Like, it totally like that. Yeah, it was a great metaphor. It was really, really a fun read. When I think about things that I didn't like about it, the only things that made the story difficult for me are things that are always going to make a Russian translated story difficult for me. Because the names are unfamiliar, it takes me a few readings. When you're reading a big book, you have like several chapters where you can get used to saying people's names in your head. Whereas when you're reading a short story, I was still stumbling over the names, which slows down my reading. But I really, I don't fault that of the story, because that's just the outcome of the translated story. I can't really think of anything that I didn't like about the story. I found it really fun and really lively. It wasn't like in-depth, super serious, philosophy of life type story, but it was really, really fun and enjoyable, and it's probably something that I'm going to pass to my son very, when we get off the podcast, because I think he would love it. I think this is a story that a lot of teenage boys would get a kick out of, whereas you've got a teenage boy that doesn't like to read. Sometimes it can be hard to find really interesting reading material that they will get down that doesn't have a dinosaur or a dragon in it. So, I think this story is regardless of age.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think if you don't have my problem with magical realism, I think this is a story which could be read by people of all sorts of different ages, and I'm sure I can imagine a young teenager reading this and getting a kick out of it.
Yeah, it's really funny. It's got a lot of, young kid humor in it, which I think that the story, for our readers that have children, I think this would be a really fun story to share with them. To share the better translation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, was there anything else that you wanted to say, Anais?
Well, I wanted to get a little bit more into the class theme. So we touched upon the humorous parts of it. How all of a sudden, this guy's in a uniform. The nose guy, it's not even a guy. This nose is in a uniform, and literally overnight, just because he's in a uniform, now he has a private chauffeur and servants. And the policeman says something like, "Oh, when I saw him coming because of his uniform, I thought he was a state counselor, but then I got a closer look. I put on my glasses and I realized, oh, it's actually a nose." And I feel like Gogol at that point is kind of saying it's kind of like a rib in general, people in uniforms that appear a certain way, because it seems like all of these people's identities are tied up in not who they are on the inside, but what they look like on the outside, right? Because that's really what Kovalev cares about.
And what
Everything comes down to
the outside is determined by their jobs.
right, exactly. Yeah, there's this obsession with class. And I mean, Kovalev's constantly name dropping all the women he visits, the wife of the state counselor, right? All the time. He's just like, "Oh yeah, my friend, Madam whatever, Madam Russian name." Um, and
And you're good.
yeah, and when he's thinking about, who he's gonna marry, he doesn't think about the qualities he would like in a wife. He's like somebody who can fetch him a 200,000 ruble dowry, like the one thing on the list. And I feel like it's written in a way where there's no room. Like, you're supposed to, I don't know, maybe you guys don't feel this way, but I feel like you're supposed to dislike Kovalev a little bit, like laugh at him. He's a little like a buffoon. I don't know if you guys got that sense, but he's not a hero. Yeah.
No, he's not a hero. He's not attractive. I saw him as dumpy, older, kind of, thinks he's above his station and constantly striving to get to a higher station type person. Definitely a buffoon. And the thread of class is very interconnected with the thread of shame. Like, literally, his face, when his nose is gone, it's not a bloody mess. It's smooth, and it's is really going to notice unless you're right up on him, because it's not like a gaping hole or anything. But he has so much shame in losing that he's covered himself as he's going through town, and he's like so much shame of losing that it's lowered his station.
Yeah, there's this whole class thing running through it, and I think you're right, Anais, when you say that he's judging himself by how others perceive him, and he's judging them too, and yeah, the nose instantly becomes not a celebrity, but someone. I can't believe I'm saying this. The nose is becoming someone of a higher status because of what he's wearing, and it's just it's just so typical of you people judging other people by what they see and not what the people are.
And what you just said really explains the end of the story. Because this nose has gone out on its own and it has achieved this high status. So when he gets it back, it's not only valued more because he had lost it, but it's also valued more because it had done all these things that he doesn't normally get to do. And so he feels like he has now been elevated in some way because his nose is super duper special and dandy.
Yeah, because everyone in the city knows about the nose, right? Like, there's that paragraph of all the stuff the nose does for a few weeks, and everybody knows about it, and it's attracting crowds. So now he's walking around, and he's Major Kovalev of that nose, of that famous nose.
Did
Yeah.
you see anything else in this story?
Well, other than identity and class, the shame thing. Although the shame thing, I would have called, it was kind of like a fear. I didn't see it as shame. I saw more like when his nose was missing, I read it more as him being kind of like envious that he's being outranked by by a nose that was part of him and at his rank, and now is doing better than him very quickly. Because when he is thinking about the consequences of not having a nose, the first thing he thinks is, who's going to give him a promotion now, right? Like,
who's going to marry him?
Yeah, and then who's going to marry him? No rich girl's going to marry him. When he's writing back and forth to the wife of one of the other politicians who wants him to marry her daughter, he suddenly is like getting more sympathetic. Like, just because he doesn't want to marry this girl. He doesn't have a nose, and now he's like thinking more sympathetically about the family, and you think like maybe he'll end up marrying her, but then as soon as he gets the nose back, he goes back to being who he was. Like, as soon as he is on the outside appearing the way that he wants to appear, nothing changes on the inside. It's like, it's very fake, very superficial. And the only fear is having the outside not reflect where he wants to be.
But even in the beginning of the story, when he first goes out, he is very, very worried about anybody setting eyes on him without his nose.
Not just anybody, though, because this was something that stood out for me when I was reading it. When he goes into the confectioner's store, he was so relieved that no one was there. Just the workers who were bustling around cakes.
That's
just right? Like, anybody doesn't mean anybody. Anybody means anyone of a status. He doesn't care. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Great point. Great point.
Yeah. Yeah, because the line follows right after. He goes, "Oh, there's people here shuffling cakes on trays back and forth. Thank God no one's here." I'm like,
Yeah.
You just said there was people there.
I guess they don't count. Because also, like, he refers to anyone lower than him, not by name, but by class. There's the beggar, and then there's all the maids and valets. The only low-class person who gets a name is his valet, Ivan, and the barber, Ivan.
Yeah.
Both Ivan. Like, everyone's Ivan. Yeah.
That's Russian literature for you.
Yeah.
Through a really thick book, and it's like everybody has the same name. It's very frustrating. So, Gerald, what did let's just get a little deeper into the story. When you were reading it, did you have any emotional responses to any parts of the story outside of just, I can't believe that there is this random nose running around the place. This is ridiculous.
In a way, yes, because I thought when the guy first wakes up, Kovalev, when he wakes up and finds his nose missing, for me it showed how things can change without you creating that change. So stuff can happen overnight, as did happen to him, and no matter what you do, you can't change that. You have to deal with the change that has occurred. So I think that's, I sort of related to that, because it's there's a lot of things that have sort of happened to and around me that I just thought, I can't, this has happened, so let's deal with it, let's move on, and that's what he was doing. So I sort of, related to that. But after that, I just struggled. I couldn't get past the nose.
Yeah, but Gerald, Gogol spoke directly to you in Act 4. He said, "I know you think this is weird, but sometimes weird things happen."
Yeah, he was talking to me.
Running down the
people
street.
like you, people who are like, "Oh, this is weird." He was like, "I know."
Yeah.
Rule he broke the fourth wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, the whole thing seemed like it was supposed to be on a stage, which is probably why I referenced the stage earlier, because it's like,
I actually could really easily see this both as a play and as like a puppet show, especially like the old puppet shows that they used to have in Russia. I could totally see this done in that style, and I think it would be a really, really fun experience to see this done as a really awesome puppet show with a giant nose running around the place.
And the nose changes size, huh?
Yeah. Hey.
Hey, we're trying to keep this one clean.
Yes.
Only accessible to turn. Don't ruin it, Annie's. Do you guys have anything else you want to talk about, or are you guys ready to rate the story?
I don't know. I feel like the story's so easy that I like.
Yeah, I don't really feel like I have that much to say like the themes were really, really blatant. There wasn't a whole lot of nuance, I don't feel. Like, you talk about stories where, like, you have to talk about them for an hour just to understand what you read. This isn't one of those stories.
No.
And so, I'm ready to rate it, definitely. I don't really have anything about the story that I disliked outside of just general, reading a Russian story, pain in the butt names.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm ready to rate.
Should Gerald go first so we get the...
Yeah, let's get him over. We accidentally sway him because he says we sway him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. Yeah, you aren't going to sway me this week anyway. Geez, I hadn't really thought about this. I think I'm going to rate it a 3 because there was fun in it. There were funny bits. It was the translation was written in a easily accessible way, and it was and it's down to me for not sort of getting with the whole theme of the story. So, but yeah, I didn't enjoy it particularly. So, but thank you, Anais, for suggesting it. We have to read things like this. It's a wide variety.
I just listened to an entire bunch of short stories by Annie Proulx. The story we read the other week, the half skin sphere.
Yeah.
I'm like, how do you pronounce her name? And I wouldn't have found her on my own. There's no way I would have found her. And it's through reading all these various stories, some we like, some we don't, that we find new authors that we enjoy. For me, I'm not exactly sure how to rate the story, and I'm realizing that when I'm rating stories, I really need to rate them according, not just as like, is this the best story in the world, but also what type of story it is. So for me, this is 18th century, 19th century satire. I feel like if I rate it as that, it's like a 5. Like, it's really well done. Whereas if I were rating it as like, the best story of all time versus the worst story of all time, it probably is like a 4. And so I'm gonna rate it a 5 because I feel like what it's doing really, really well. It isn't the best satire I've ever read. It isn't even the best old satire I've read, but it is really, really well done satire. How about you, Annie?
Yeah, I tend to rate everything according to how I feel. Very personal.
Yeah.
So, for me, it's a 4. I feel a 4.
3, 4, 5.
That was fun. That was really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you know what? Has anybody rated last week's story? Because I know we're recording off schedule, so I don't think people have had a time to rate last week's story, right?
Yeah, we're recording way too early, but just in case people don't know what we read last week, it was The School by Donald Bartlemy. So go rate it. Go listen to it, read it, and then go rate it.
Well, read it, then listen to it, then go rate it.
There's an order, and I think someone will get it right.
There's an order of operations.
Please excuse my dad.
Okay. So what are we all submitting for next week's story? I mean, I'm obvious. I still want to read that Twitter story, Black Box by Jennifer Egan. What do you want to read?
I'm suggesting I've gone back to Card Magazine, which is a great resource for sort of
I love that magazine.
newer, more unknown writers, and I haven't read it. I don't read these stories first, but it's called Not From Here by Angela Mitchell.
Okay, it's time for the game. Are you guys
ready? How are you torturing us this week?
I'm waiting for the thunder to pass. Rainy season's here.
Okay.
So this is going to be another one of those kind of like shot in the dark guessing games that I love. I'm going to give you a Russian word, and you have to tell me if it's a 19th century Russian author or a brand of vodka.
Oh my God, I love you, Anais. I love you so much.
Very good.
Best game ever.
Excellent. Very, very good.
That is so awesome.
This is a top
Let's
game.
do it.
Okay, who wants to go first?
Well, you tell us.
Let Gerald go first, because he's going down.
Going down, Gerald.
This week.
Yeah, you said that before.
Okay, the word is Herzen.
Herzen. That's vodka.
It's an author who apparently wrote Who is to Blame?
Oh.
There's no stealing because there's only 2 options, so.
Okay.
Your question. Panaeva.
That's a vodka.
Also an author. She wrote A Woman's Lot. See?
Oh, I was so close to saying author, and I was like, no, she wouldn't do 2 vodkas, 2 authors in a row.
Of course I would. It's gotta play with the mind. Gotta psych.
Man, there you go, messing with us.
Oh, you're messing with us.
Gerald
You.
Kaufman.
That's an author.
That's a vodka. I psyched you.
Okay.
It has a wheat base. I didn't know vodkas have different bases, so I'm learning.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Some are wheat, some are made of potatoes, some are made of, you can even make them out of grapes.
Mm-hmm. Maya. Pasternak. Pasternak.
Vodka.
Author. It's because you probably know the full name, Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago. Guys, if you get no points, who wins?
I know. That's what I'm wondering. You'd think 50-50 chance that we would all get something.
Yeah, maybe.
Bell curve, where'd it go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just squash that bell curve.
Okay, Gerald.
You.
Moskovskaya.
Why are you giving him all the ones I know?
That'll be vodka.
That's vodka, right?
Yay! Yeah,
I
I
only
knew
got a
that.
point, girl. How do you feel?
Yeah. I try not to let it go to my head.
Okay. Maya. Renovuha.
Author.
Vodka. Horseradish based.
Really?
Apparently.
Wow.
Tradition.
You can make it out of anything.
Yeah.
So we can end here. I had 2 more for tiebreakers if you just want to hear them, or we can end here with Gerald with 1
Let's
point.
do them. Let's do them. I want to know. I want to
Okay.
know.
Okay.
Gerald.
You.
Pushkin.
That's an author.
That's an author.
Yay.
Pushkin. And Maya, well, I mean, if you get it right, he still wins, but for fun. Uspensky.
That's an author.
That's an author, and he wrote The Steamed Chicken, which is just funny.
I'm glad we got our extras because, it would be a game literally with no points.
You got 1 point, Gerald got 2 points, and a 50-50 chance game. So
Wow.
You know what? Because what if normally if you just guess randomly, you're gonna get a certain amount. We both failed. It was like we purposefully wanted to get them wrong.
We shouldn't go to Vegas. That's
yeah, we should not go to Vegas.
I want Maya to win one of these days. I want to read that Twitter story.
I may just give out
excited.
on my own.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I would totally read the Twitter story, but Carve Magazine has been so good for this podcast. We've always liked their stories, so I'm like, this is gonna be good. I already know.
Maybe.
Yeah, they have really good stories, and they pick a lot of interesting new authors, and I like that. I like journals where you don't just find great established authors, but you'll find random new authors in the mix. I really enjoy that.
So Gerald, what are we reading
next week?
We are reading Not From Here by Angela Mitchell.
But first, let us know what you thought of The Nose in the comment section at literaryroadhouse.com. And please, please, please take a minute, leave an iTunes, Stitcher, or Spreaker review, and be sure to share the podcast with your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.